She traveled west to marry a rancher, but a wordless little boy met her at the door. The stagecoach left her in a desolate world. The ranch was a canvas of stark loneliness, deceptive stillness, and a grief so thick it felt like dust in her lungs. Sarah clutched her satchel, every hope she owned packed inside. She was no blushing tenderfoot. She was a survivor running from a past she prayed would never find her answering a stranger's ad to stave off the wolves for good. Her gaze swept the porch, searching for the rancher promised in the letters. But the porch was not empty. A small boy sat there alone, his stillness absolute, his eyes as ancient as the plains. He watched her approach without a single sound. She had answered a rancher's ad for a wife. Instead, she found a silent sentinel guarding a house of ghosts. A chilling question took root: was she here to build a family, or to become its next secret? The rattle of the stagecoach wheels faded into a memory, leaving Sarah alone in a world of desolate silence. A cloud of ochre dust, disturbed by its departure, settled slowly back onto the thirsty earth, coating her worn traveling dress in a fine, gritty film. The wind, the only living thing in this vast emptiness, sang a lonely song through the sparse, skeletal sagebrush. It wasn't a welcoming sound. It was the sound of a secret being kept. Before her, the land stretched out under a sky so vast and indifferent it threatened to swallow her whole. This was it, the end of the line. Far in the distance, nestled against a low, brooding mesa, was the ranch. Jacob Price's ranch. From here it was just a dark speck, a single stitch holding the earth and sky together. Each step she took toward it felt both impossibly heavy and terrifyingly light. The letters in her satchel had been sparse, the words practical, written in a strong, clear hand that spoke of fences to be mended and winters to be endured. They had not spoken of beauty. They had not spoken of loneliness. She had filled in the empty spaces herself, painting pictures of a simple, sturdy life. A life where the ghosts of Boston, of sterile hospital rooms, and the cloying scent of failure could not reach her. As she drew closer, the ranch resolved into a 2-story skeleton of sun-bleached timber and a wide, empty porch. A barn stood beside it, its paint peeling like sunburnt skin. The place wasn't derelict. It was simply hollow. It was a body without a soul. Still, she straightened her spine, smoothing the wrinkles from her dress with a trembling hand. This was her chance. Her last one. She was ready to meet the man whose letters had promised a new beginning. But the porch was not empty. A small figure sat on the top step, perfectly still. It was a boy no older than 8, with a mop of dusty brown hair and a face smudged with dirt. He wore patched overalls and no shoes, his bare feet planted firmly on the wooden planks as if he were growing from them. He wasn't playing. He wasn't waiting. He was simply being. A statue carved from silence. A slow, cold prickle of unease traced its way up Sarah's neck. This wasn't right. The letters had mentioned nothing of a child. She stopped at the foot of the steps, her shadow stretching long before her in the afternoon sun. "Hello there," she said, her voice softer than she intended, a fragile sound in the heavy air. The boy did not answer. He didn't even blink. He just stared at her, and his eyes were the most unsettling thing she had ever seen. They were not the eyes of a child. They held the weary, watchful stillness of an old man who had seen 100 hard winters and expected 100 more. She took a hesitant step up. Is your father home, Silence?" A hawk cried out far overhead, a sharp, piercing sound that only made the quiet around the boy seem deeper. He was a well, and his silence was a darkness with no bottom. Just as a knot of true fear began to tighten in her stomach, a man emerged from the barn, a silhouette against the blinding sun. He was tall and broad, his shoulders built to carry the weight of the world, and his face looked as if he'd been doing just that. His features were hard-carved from the same unforgiving landscape that surrounded them, his eyes the color of a stormy sky. He moved with a heavy, deliberate grace, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. This had to be Jacob Price. He looked nothing and everything like the man she had imagined. "Mr. Price," Sarah asked, her voice regaining a sliver of its former resolve. "I'm Sarah. Sarah Thorne." He stopped, his gaze sweeping over her, taking in the dusty dress, the worn satchel, the hope and fear warring in her eyes. There was no flicker of a smile, no warmth of a welcome. "I know," he said, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder. "You're here." It wasn't a greeting. It was a statement of fact, as devoid of emotion as the packed earth beneath their feet. He finally looked at the boy, and for a fraction of a second something unreadable, pain, regret, exhaustion, clouded his features. Sarah tried again, gesturing toward the silent child. "And this is—" Jacob's jaw tightened. "He's Eli." He looked back at Sarah, his eyes a warning. "He don't talk." The finality in his tone was a slammed door. Not that he wouldn't talk, but that he didn't. It was a rule of the house, a law of this desolate land. Jacob picked up her satchel, the movement rough, impersonal. "The house is clean. Your room is at the top of the stairs. I'll be in after I see to the horses." He brushed past her, leaving her alone on the porch with the silent boy. Sarah watched him go, then looked at Eli, who hadn't moved a muscle. He was still watching her, his ancient eyes holding a secret she was now a part of, whether she wanted to be or not. Stepping inside, she was met with a brutal cleanliness. The floors were scrubbed bare, the furniture sparse and functional. But it held no warmth. On the wall in the main room, a faint, clean rectangle marked the space where a large picture had once hung, a ghostly outline of a missing memory. The silence in this house wasn't empty. It was full. It was heavy. It had a name she did not yet know. She had come here to escape a ghost, and as she stood in the growing shadows, she realized she hadn't escaped at all. She'd just walked into a different grave. Dawn arrived, not with warmth, but with a thin pale light that seeped through the window pane, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the sterile air of Sarah's room. She had not slept. The silence in this house was a physical weight. A fourth resident that sat at the table stood in the halls and lay beside her in the cold, empty bed. It was a silence made of unspoken words and unwept tears. But Sarah Thorne was not a woman to be defeated by quiet. She rose, her movements deliberate, a quiet declaration of war against the stillness. Downstairs, the kitchen was a shrine to function. Pots hung from hooks, scrubbed to a dull shine. The wood-burning stove was cold, its iron belly empty. Sarah set to work. She stoked the embers, ground the coffee, sliced the bacon. The smells, rich and warm and full of life, felt like a trespass here. The sizzle of the fat in the cast-iron skillet was a shout in a library. She was turning bacon when she felt his presence. Eli stood in the doorway, a small, still shadow. He watched her, his ancient eyes tracking her every move, his expression a blank canvas. He did not seem curious. He seemed to be studying a strange new species, trying to understand its purpose. "Good morning, Eli," she said, her voice bright, false. "I'm making breakfast. I hope you're hungry." He simply watched. Jacob entered a few moments later, his presence sucking the small warmth from the room. He nodded, once a curt mechanical gesture, and sat at the head of the plain wooden table. He did not thank her. He did not comment on the food. "We eat at sunrise," was all he said. The meal was an exercise in agony. The only sounds were the scrape of forks on tin plates and the loud, frantic beating of Sarah's own heart. Eli ate with a slow, methodical precision, his gaze flitting between her and Jacob. They were two opposing forces at a silent negotiating table, and he was the prize, the witness, the judge. Sarah tried to breach the wall. "The stove draws well," she offered, the words sounding foolish and loud. Jacob took a long drink of coffee, his eyes fixed on the far wall. "Aye, Another minute of suffocating quiet. "It's a sturdy house, Mr. Price," she tried again. "My father built it," he replied, and the conversation was over. He finished his meal, pushed his chair back with a loud scrape, and walked out the door without another word. Left alone with Eli, Sarah felt the boy's gaze on her. It was not hostile. It was assessing. She gave him a small, weak smile. He looked down at his empty plate, then slipped from his chair and vanished as silently as he had appeared. The house swallowed him. The silence returned. That afternoon, Sarah decided she could not live in a museum of grief. She needed to make this place her own, even if its occupants refused to let her in. She began to clean, not because it was dirty, it was brutally clean, but to understand its geography. Every room smelled of lye soap and the faint ghost of lavender. But the door at the end of the upstairs hall was different. It wore its silence like a shroud. The brass knob was tarnished unlike the others. When she tried it, a metallic scrape confirmed her suspicion. The lock held firm. A small hook of curiosity snagged in her mind. What was he hiding later in a small storage closet under the stairs, tucked away in a dusty crate of old linens? She found it. It was a small rosewood music box, its silver inlay tarnished to a dull gray. It was beautiful, or had been once. When she lifted the lid, she expected the tinny, sweet chime of a forgotten melody. Nothing. The mechanism was broken, silent, just like everything else in this house. An idea, a small act of defiance, took hold. She spent an hour with a soft rag and a bit of oil patiently polishing the silver, coaxing a shy gleam from the tarnished metal. She worked the grime from the carved roses on the lid. She couldn't fix the music, but she could restore its beauty. When she was done, she didn't hide it. She placed it on the center of the stone mantelpiece in the main room, a single, small testament to a past that someone was trying so desperately to erase. It was a mistake. Jacob came in as dusk was painting the sky in bruised purples. He stopped dead in the center of the room, his eyes locking on the music box. The air grew cold, heavy. He didn't shout. His voice when he spoke was dangerously quiet, a sound far more terrifying than any rage. "What is this? I found it." Sarah said, her hands twisting in her apron. It was in a crate, all covered in dust. "You thought wrong," he cut in his voice like chipping ice. He walked to the mantelpiece, his movements stiff. "Some things are best left in the dark. Some things are not your concern." He picked up the box. He didn't throw it. He didn't smash it. He simply took it, his large calloused hands cradling it for a moment with a strange, agonizing tenderness. Then he turned and walked to a low cabinet in the corner, opened it, and placed the box back into the darkness, shutting the door with a soft, final click. He turned back to her, his face an unreadable mask of stone. "You are here to cook, to clean, to keep the house. You are not here to dig up bones." He walked out, leaving her standing in the center of the room, her heart pounding. The emotional undercurrent had finally broken the surface, a cold, bitter wave that threatened to drown her. She finally understood. Jacob hadn't brought her here to build a new life. He'd brought her here to stand guard over an old death. Her gaze drifted back to the second floor, to the hallway she could just see from the bottom of the stairs, to the locked door. The key to it, all she knew with a bone-deep certainty, was hidden behind that silent, forbidden door. After the incident with the music box, the silence in the house changed. It was no longer heavy and stagnant. It was sharp. It was a field of broken glass that Sarah had to walk through barefoot every single day. Jacob's words had drawn a clear, brutal line in the dust. "You are not here to dig up bones." So she stopped digging. She stopped asking questions. She moved through the house with a quiet efficiency that mirrored his own, a ghost in her own new life. But she would not surrender. If the world of the Father was closed to her, she would try to enter the world of the Son. One afternoon, when the sun was a mellow, golden thing, and the relentless wind had softened to a sigh, she took a piece of charcoal from the hearth and a smooth, splintered plank of wood. She sat on the porch steps, Eli's silent throne, and she began to draw. She drew the barn, its roof line sagging like a weary sigh. She drew the vast empty sky. She drew a clumsy four-legged creature that was meant to be a horse. She did not look for him. She did not call to him. She simply created, letting the soft scratch of charcoal on wood be her invitation. For a long time, nothing happened. Then a shadow detached itself from the barn. Eli moved with a fluid, soundless grace, coming to a stop a few feet away, his old eyes fixed on the plank. He watched as she added a crooked tail, a lopsided mane. He watched for 10 minutes, his stillness as profound as the mesa on the horizon. Then he moved. He stepped forward, his bare feet making no sound, and knelt beside her. His small, dirt-smudged finger reached out and touched her hand. A touch as light as a moth's wing, yet it landed with the force of a thunderclap in the silent world they shared. His finger gently guided hers, pushing the charcoal, correcting the line of the horse's back, adding the subtle curve of a powerful haunch. He knew this animal. He knew its strength, its spirit. He couldn't speak of it, but he could show her. When he was done, the creature on the plank was no longer a clumsy sketch. It was alive. Sarah's heart ached with a sudden, fierce tenderness. This was his voice. This was his language. A shadow fell over them. Jacob stood there, his large frame blocking the sun. He looked down at the drawing on the plank, his face a mask of stone. Sarah braced herself for the anger, for the cold dismissal. She expected him to snatch the plank away, to send her back inside with another icy command. But he said nothing. He simply stared at the horse his silent son had helped her draw. His gaze shifted to Eli, who had frozen, his hand still hovering near Sarah's. The air crackled with a new and complicated tension. It was not anger. It was something deeper, something far more wounded. It was the agony of a man watching a stranger unlock a door he had long since lost the key to. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud. "The wagon's hitched," he said, his voice rough, his eyes fixed somewhere over Sarah's head. "We need supplies from the settlement." He turned and walked away before she could answer. It wasn't a command to her, not directly. But it wasn't a dismissal either. It was something else entirely. A crack in the wall. The journey to the settlement was a silent one, but the day was a revelation. The town was little more than a single dusty street with a mercantile, a smithy, and a saloon, but the sound of voices of laughter felt like a foreign music to Sarah's ears. While Jacob loaded sacks of flour and salt, Sarah went inside the mercantile. A woman with kind, crinkling eyes and flour on her apron smiled at her. "You must be Sarah," she said warmly. "I'm Martha Gable. It's good to see a woman's touch out at that place again." Sarah felt a blush rise to her cheeks. "It's a quiet place." "It wasn't always," Martha said, her voice dropping conspiratorially as she weighed a bag of beans. "Not when Rebecca was alive." The name landed like a stone in a still pond. Rebecca. Oh, Lord, that woman was pure sunlight. Martha continued, her eyes growing misty with the memory. She had a laugh you could hear clear across the valley, and she could make anything grow in that stubborn soil. She saw the beauty in it, you see. In him, too. She nodded subtly toward the door where Jacob was working. And that boy. Eli. He used to talk a blue streak, never a moment's quiet. Followed his mother everywhere, chattering like a little magpie. Sarah stood frozen, the bag of beans forgotten in her hands. A chattering boy. A woman made of sunlight. A man who knew how to smile. It was a vision of a world so alien from the one she inhabited that it felt like a fairy tale. What? What happened? Sarah whispered the question, escaping before she could stop it. Martha's smile faded. A shadow of profound sadness crossed her face. "The land gives," she said softly, "and the land takes. It was a terrible accident. A storm. Jacob, he hasn't been the same since. None of them have." The ride back to the ranch was different. The silence in the wagon was the same, but Sarah was no longer listening to it. She was listening to the ghosts of what used to be. The setting sun was no longer beautiful, it was mournful, a daily reminder of a light that had been extinguished. She looked at Jacob's stone profile at the hard line of his jaw, and for the first time she didn't see a cold or cruel man. She saw a man haunted by the ghost of his own past happiness. She finally had a name for the phantom that filled the silent house. Its name was Joy. And her new burning question was no longer just what was behind the locked door, but what terrible storm could be strong enough to extinguish the sun. The day was born, holding its breath. A suffocating stillness settled over the ranch, the usual wind dying to a whisper. The air grew thick, soupy, heavy with the scent of ozone and unshed rain. By midday, the sky was no longer blue, but a strange, bruised yellow, and the sun was a weak, feverish eye behind a high, thin veil of cloud. The cattle in the pastures were restless, their lowing carrying a nervous, questioning edge. Even the house seemed to be weighting its timbers, groaning in anticipation. Sarah felt it in her bones, a primal unease that had nothing to do with Jacob's moods or Eli's silence. This was the land itself, preparing for a war. Jacob came in from the fields early, his face grim, his eyes scanning the horizon. "See to the shutters," he ordered, his voice tight. "And bring in the wood. All of it." There was no room for argument. Sarah worked alongside him, the two of them moving in a tense, unspoken rhythm, their shared purpose a fragile bridge over the chasm of silence between them. As she dragged a heavy basket of wood onto the porch, she looked for Eli. He was where he always was, a small, still figure sitting on the edge of the corral watching the nervous horses. But today, his stillness seemed different. It wasn't watchful. It was rigid, a posture of dread. He was watching the sky. He knew what was coming. The storm broke just as the last shutter was latched. The first clap of thunder didn't roll. It shattered the world, a violent, percussive crack that seemed to split the sky directly overhead. The bruised yellow turned to a furious churning purple-black. Rain fell not in drops, but in solid hissing sheets, a solid wall of water that erased the world beyond the windows. The wind returned, not as a song, but as a scream, tearing at the house, searching for a way in. They were trapped, the three of them, in the dim, lamp-lit quiet of the main room. The roar outside was deafening, a constant raging chaos. For an hour they existed in this suspended reality. Jacob stood by the window staring out into the maelstrom. Sarah sat at the table, her hands clenched in her lap. And Eli was gone. The realization dawned on them at the same moment. A sudden shared intake of breath. The space where the boy had been huddled by the hearth was empty. Sarah called out, her voice swallowed by the thunder. Jacob spun from the window, his face a mask of dawning horror. Eli, he roared, his voice a raw, powerful thing that cut through the storm's fury. They tore through the small house, their movements frantic, desperate. His room was empty, the kitchen, the pantry empty. The terror was a cold, sharp thing in Sarah's chest. The front door was slightly ajar, swinging wildly in the wind. He was outside. He was out in the storm. The barn, Jacob yelled, grabbing a heavy oilskin coat. He goes there when he's scared. They plunged into the tempest. The rain was a physical assault, blinding them, stealing their breath. The world was a churning nightmare of mud and roaring wind. The short distance to the barn felt like a mile. The creek, normally a placid ribbon of water they could step across, was now a churning, angry brown torrent already spilling its banks, clawing at the foundations of the barn. And there, inside the barn's wide-open doorway, was Eli. He wasn't crying. He wasn't hiding. He was standing just inside the entrance, his small body rigid, staring at the rising muddy water with a terrifying vacancy. He was seeing not just the flood of today, but the ghost of a flood from long ago. His small face was a mask of old, remembered horror. The water swirled around the barn's entrance, inches from his bare feet. Eli Jacob bellowed, his voice raw with a terror that went beyond the storm. "Son, come back." But the boy was deaf to him, lost in a waking nightmare. He was trapped not by the water, but by a memory. Jacob started forward, but a surge of water carrying a splintered log crashed against the bank, cutting him off. He was only 20 feet away, but it might as well have been a lifetime. And in that moment, seeing his son frozen on the edge of the same abyss that had claimed his past, the wall Jacob Price had built around his heart did not just crack, it exploded. A sound tore from his throat, a sound of such profound, bottomless agony that it silenced the storm itself. It was not a word. It was the sound of a soul being torn in two, a sound of pure, primal terror that had been locked away for years. Eli. He plunged into the thigh-deep churning water, fighting the current, his eyes locked on his son. He was no longer a stoic rancher. He was just a father terrified of losing everything all over again. Without a thought, Sarah grabbed a length of thick rope from the porch, tying one end to a sturdy post and lunging into the mud after him, the other end clutched in her hand. "Jacob, take it!" she screamed. He turned his eyes wild and grabbed the rope. Sarah braced herself, her boots sinking into the mud, becoming his anchor as he fought his way to the barn, to the son who was lost in the past. He reached Eli, sweeping the boy's rigid body into his arms, and turned, letting Sarah and the rope guide them back through the treacherous water to the relative safety of the house. They collapsed inside, drenched, shivering, and breathing in ragged, tearing sobs. The storm still raged outside, but a different storm had just been unleashed within. Jacob knelt on the floor, clutching his silent, trembling son, his broad shoulders shaking with a grief that was new and ancient all at once. He was staring at his son, but Sarah knew he was seeing a ghost. He finally looked up at Sarah, his eyes stripped bare of all their defenses, and in them she saw the full, terrifying truth of the storm that had never ended for him. The rain had begun to lessen, but the house was filled with the sound of a man drowning in his own memory. And Sarah knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that the telling was about to begin. The world outside was washed clean and wounded. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky of impossible clarity and a landscape littered with the debris of its fury. The wind was a gentle, mournful sigh, whispering through the broken branches of the cottonwood by the creek. Inside the house, the silence that returned was different. It was not the sharp, hostile quiet of before. It was the exhausted quiet of a battlefield after the fighting is done heavy with the ghosts of the fallen. Eli was asleep, wrapped in a dry blanket before the hearth, his face finally peaceful in the flickering firelight. Sarah had brewed coffee, the bitter dark scent a small anchor in the disorienting calm. She sat at the table watching Jacob. He hadn't moved. He sat in a low chair, his large frame slumped, his elbows on his knees, staring into the flames as if searching for an answer in the dancing embers. The stoic mask he wore was gone, shattered by the storm, and in its place was the raw, unguarded face of a man utterly broken. He had not spoken a word since they'd brought Eli inside. Sarah did not press him. Words were useless here. They were stones thrown into a bottomless canyon of grief. She simply rose, refilled his cup with coffee, and placed it back in his trembling hands. Her fingers brushed his, and he didn't pull away. That small contact, that shared warmth, was the only permission he needed. It was a day like this one, he began, his voice a low, rough monotone, stripped of all emotion. He was not speaking to her, but to the ghosts in the fire. The sky looked just the same. Sickly. Rebecca. She could smell a storm coming before the cattle could. She told me the creek would rise. He took a long, shaky breath. She wasn't afraid of anything. Not of this land. Not of the work. said the thunder was just God clearing his throat. A flicker of a smile so full of pain it was a grimace touched his lips for a half-second, and then vanished. I was down creek, mending the fence line that had washed out the week before. I told her to stay in the house with the boy. I said I'd handle it. He fell silent, the memory pulling him under. But she never listened. Not when she had her mind set. The horses were spooked. She went to the barn to gentle them, to lead them to higher ground. She took Eli with her. He was always with her. The fire crackled, spitting a shower of orange sparks. The water, it came so fast, not a rise a wall. A solid brown wall of water and mud and splintered trees. I saw it from the ridge. I ran. God, how I ran. But I was too late. His voice broke just for a moment, a single jagged crack in the stone. The barn just splintered. She was trying to get the horses out. The water took her. It took her right in front of him. He was on a ledge just inside where she'd pushed him. Safe. He saw it all, Sarah. He saw his mother. He saw her get swept away. The last thing she screamed, Jacob's body convulsed with a silent racking sob. The last thing she screamed was his name. There it was. The truth. A truth so brutal and ugly, it had poisoned every corner of this house every moment of their lives. It had stolen a woman made of sunlight and silenced a boy who chattered like a magpie. He hasn't said a word since Jacob whispered, his voice ragged. Not one word. The doctor said the shock of it locked his voice away, locked him away. And it's my fault. It was my fence that broke. My job to protect them. I failed her, and I broke my son. He finally looked at her, his eyes hollowed out by years of relentless, solitary guilt. I saw your letter. I thought maybe a woman's presence, that it could somehow fix him. Fix what I broke. It was a fool's hope. I brought you into this grave and gave you no shovel. Sarah looked at this giant of a man, undone by his own heart, and she felt no judgment. Only a profound, aching empathy. She moved from her chair and knelt on the floor beside him. She did not offer empty reassurances. She simply placed her hand on his trembling arm, a small, steady pressure. A silent message. You are not alone in this anymore. He leaned into her touch, a shudder running through him, and for the first time in years, the great and terrible weight of his grief was shared. After a long time he stood. He walked to the mantelpiece, his movements slow ancient. From a nail hidden high above the stone, half concealed by a water stain, he took down a small iron key. He returned and pressed it into her hand. It was cold and heavy. The room, he said, his voice hoarse. It's hers. Rebecca's. I locked it the day after the funeral. I couldn't bear to look at it, to smell her in the linens. Everything is just as she left it. He met her eyes, a silent plea mingling with his pain. Sarah closed her fingers around the key. This key wasn't just for a room. It was the key to a memory, to a life, and perhaps to a future. And as she held its cold weight, she knew that opening that door would be the bravest thing she had ever done. The key felt like a cold, heavy secret in her palm. For a full day, Sarah did not use it. She simply carried it in her apron pocket, its weight a constant reminder of the trust she'd been given. Then, on the second morning when the sun was high and the world felt steady on its axis again, she walked to the end of the hall. The lock turned with a groan of long-disused metal. The door swung inward. She stepped not into a tomb, but into a pocket of trapped sunlight. The room was Rebecca's. A half-finished quilt, a riot of color, lay across a rocking chair. A stack of books sat on the nightstand, one left face down, as if the reader intended to return at any moment. Dried wildflowers, their colors faded to gentle pastels, stood in a mason jar on the windowsill. It was a room of life, of laughter, of a spirit so vibrant it seemed to linger in the very air, smelling of lavender and old sunshine. This was the joy that had been locked away. Sarah did not pack it up. She did not erase it. She walked to the heavy curtains, pulled them wide, and pushed open the window. Fresh air, smelling of rain-washed sage and new beginnings, flooded the room, stirring the ghosts. She left the door open when she walked out. She left it open for good. Healing did not come like a flash flood. It came slowly like the spring thaw. It was in the small moments. It was in Jacob, his shoulders a little less stooped, meeting her eyes across the dinner table for a half-second longer than before. It was in Eli, who began to leave his charcoal drawings on the kitchen table for her to find a horse, a hawk, a clumsy but recognizable flower. It was in the work. The storm had broken the longest stretch of fence along the creek bed. One bright morning they went to fix it. The three of them. The sun was warm on their backs, the sound of the mended creek a gentle babble. They worked in a comfortable quiet, a silence no longer made of pain but of shared purpose. Jacob dug the post holes, his movements strong and sure. Sarah stretched the wire, her hands once soft, now calloused and capable. And Eli worked between them, a quiet, essential bridge, handing them nails, holding the posts steady. As the sun began to dip toward the mesa, painting the sky in strokes of apricot and rose, they finished. Jacob drove the last staple home. He stepped back, wiping sweat from his brow, and looked not at the fence but at Sarah and then at his son. A real smile, small and weary but genuine, touched his lips. "Good work," he said, his voice soft. He looked at Eli. "You did good, son." Sarah's heart felt impossibly full. She reached out and ruffled Eli's hair. He looked up at her and then at Jacob. His gaze drifted from the two of them to the sturdy mended fence, and then to the house on the hill where a warm light was beginning to glow in the window. His lips parted. "Home," he said. The word was quiet, rough with disuse, but it landed with the force of a sunrise. It was not just a word. It was a verdict, a destination reached. It rearranged the world, chasing the last of the shadows from the corners of their lives. Jacob's eyes filled with tears. He knelt and pulled his son into a fierce embrace. Sarah stood and watched them, the setting sun warm on her face. They were not a broken man, a silent boy, and a stranger. They were a family, forged in the heart of a storm and finally at peace.